Are you starting a running program in 2025? Maybe you signed up for your first 5K or you're looking to complete your first marathon. In this video, we'll cover some of the important topics when looking at reducing your risk of injuries, of common injuries like iliotibial band syndrome and Achilles tendinopathy. Majority of running injuries are due to overload, and this means that the loads placed on the tissues have exceeded what they can tolerate, and that leads to an injury or pain. So if we look at plantar fasciitis, iliotibial band syndrome, or Achilles tendon pain, those are all examples of common running injuries that are due to overload. Therefore, when first starting a running program, we want to make sure that we're not doing too much too soon, which will lead to an overload issue. Especially in the beginning, there's a lot of excitement, so we might pick a random number or base it on what someone else is doing, or even what we used to do a long time ago and say, 3 to 5 miles is what I probably can do, let me start with that. And the problem is that if you haven't been running very much, your tissues aren't used to that, and that might lead to an overload issue. When looking at the loads of a running program, there's 3 components that we need to look at: intensity, duration, and frequency. Most runners focus on duration, which can either be measured with the time of the runs or the distance of the runs. So for example, we might go for a 10 to 20 minute run or a run for 1 to 2 miles. Frequency is the second most common, and it's pretty self-explanatory because it's just how many times you ran during the week. Intensity is the third component, and typically this is the most overlooked component when we look at load. And there's a couple of different ways that we can measure this. One is by using what's called the ratings of perceived exertion, which is a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being rest, 10 being maximal effort, and then rate how challenging the run was. And the problem with using this scale is that sometimes we can be a little bit biased and we might rate the runs a little bit lower than they actually are. And so a better way is to actually use a smartwatch to measure your average heart rate. That way we can kind of see how challenging the exercise actually was with a little bit more of an objective way. And if you're curious on how to do this, I actually made a whole video on how to use a smartwatch to help make your runs better. So when looking at our running load, keeping these 3 components in mind is very important, especially when we're looking at progressing our runs. We need to make sure that we're accounting for all of these factors. The general rule is to not increase the load by more than 10% per week, although the research has actually shown that in a 2-week period, we can actually increase by up to 30% without increasing our risk of injury. But don't forget, we need to include frequency, intensity, and duration into the equation. A simple way to do this is to take the durations of the runs and multiply them by the frequency, and then multiply that by our intensity, so either the average heart rate during the runs, or we can take the ratings of perceived exertion, whichever one we use to measure intensity, and that'll give us a value per week, which is called our average workload. Then each week we can multiply that by 0.1 or 0.3, which will give us our target of how much we can increase our workload per week. For running gear, shoes are an important consideration. I mean, they're the only things that make contact with the ground when you run. But there's a lot of misleading information and a lot of confusion when it comes to shoes and injuries. It should come as no surprise that yes, you should wear running shoes when you run, but not that pair that's over 5 years old that's been sitting in the closet. And not necessarily the pair of shoes that your friend recommended or those really expensive shoes with the carbon fiber plates. Picking the proper running shoe is actually a lot more simple than you would think. To find the proper running shoe, you'll need to go to a running store, try several pairs on, go for a little bit of a run in each one of them, and then just pick the one that's the most comfortable to run in. It seems too simple, right? What about pronation control? What about arch support? What should the heel drop be? Should it be a maximalist shoe? Should it be a minimalist shoe? What should you get? Well, the thing is there's a lot of variability in how people run, and so the way people typically pick shoes is they pick a shoe on how they want to run versus what their natural pattern actually is, which potentially leads in a mismatch in shoes and picking a shoe that is uncomfortable. So keep this part simple. Try on several shoes and then run in the one that just feels the most comfortable. When it comes to how you run, this section could easily be several hours long, but let's cover some of the basics on running biomechanics, starting with pronation. Pronation is a normal movement of the foot where the inside arch drops as we make contact with the ground. The reason why this happens is it helps to absorb the loads with each step when running. So it helps to make sure that there's more foot in contact with the ground to help spread out those loads. Then during push-off, the foot does the opposite of pronation, which is called supination. This helps to stiffen the foot to help propel ourselves forward. And while pronation is commonly thought as a bad thing during running, it's actually part of the normal biomechanics and is actually a good thing. So next time somebody says that you pronate while you run, you should say, yeah, you're supposed to. Next up is Footstrike, and there's 3 different types of Footstrike. There's heel strike, midfoot strike, and forefoot strike. Although midfoot and forefoot strike are typically categorized together, and that's because majority of people are actually heel strikers. And there's quite a bit of debate on which foot strike is recommended, with the general trend being to recommend either a midfoot or a forefoot strike. But when we actually look at the research, there doesn't appear to be an advantage of one foot strike over another when looking at running efficiency or suffering a running injury. For suffering a running injury, the type of foot strike really just dictates which tissues are loaded with running. So for example, if we do either a midfoot or a forefoot strike, we're going to load the calf and the Achilles tendon more, whereas if we have a rear foot strike, we'll load the knee more. So as long as you're comfortable on your runs, there's not much of a need for you to change your foot strike, especially when you're first starting out. Finally, let's talk about step rates when running, and there's been a lot of research in this area on how step rate can be used to manage running loads and in injury prevention. Something that's common in a lot of new runners is that they'll either take larger but less frequent steps, or they'll run to complete fatigue, both of which will reduce their step rate. This decreased step rate leads to more contact time with the ground, which will increase the loads on the tissue, which will therefore increase our risk of suffering an overload injury, like patellofemoral pain syndrome, also known as runner's knee, Achilles tendon pain, and plantar fasciitis. While there isn't an optimal step rate that everyone should be running at, generally the recommendation is to aim for 170 to 180 steps per minute. So when it comes to step rate with running, aim for shorter but more frequent steps instead of larger and less frequent steps to prevent injuries. And a final bonus point, if you're experiencing a nagging injury, maybe an old ankle sprain that never quite recovered and the ankle just doesn't quite feel right, or maybe a lingering Achilles tendon pain, you want to make sure that you address those ideally before you start a running program. As you ramp up your running, these old injuries tend to resurface, especially if they weren't managed appropriately in the beginning. So to avoid any setbacks in your running program, you want to make sure that you're addressing these early on. And if you need, I have plenty of overview videos on some common running injuries that you can find here.